Hey class, welcome to another week. Hopefully you enjoyed the break in our lecture series where you got to see a more professionally made documentary on Andrew Jackson. And while I wouldn't agree with everything in it, it gives you basically the main structure for how to understand Jackson, his critics, his supporters, and kind of contextualizing a very complicated man within his own times, right? It's right to say that this age is the age of Jackson, that this guy really left his imprint upon things. But as you probably saw in the documentary and was kind of developed in different ways, right? All the things that made up Andrew Jackson both preceded him and then succeeded him, right? They happened before him and then they continued after him. So in this lecture, we're going to kind of look at some of this overlaps with some of the things in the documentary, but we're going to look at the legacy of Jackson and how Jackson defines not only the politics for the development of the United States, particularly in relationship to slavery and also banks, um, but also sort of changes different social dimensions, right? How the United States is going to grow as a nation, and how does democracy not just become a political concept, but an idea, right, of a nation of equals, so to speak, right? And as the documentary shows, while this was mainly, it was racialized, right? It was for white men predominantly, but it's the same legacy that will be taken up later by women, by freedmen, and want to pursue this for everyone, for every citizen of the United States. So we're going to look at a little bit of this. So as you saw in the documentary, right, the bank war is a huge part of Jackson's presidency, and it will continue through the administration of Jackson's right-hand man, his hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren, right? If any of you are Seinfeld fans, there's a joke about the Van Buren boys, which is a gang, and this is a reference to the president. Anyway, Van Buren continues Jackson's war against the banks. Now, I want to just highlight a few things with you about the Bank of the United States, the second one, right? I mentioned this in a few lectures ago about the sort of ominous elements about the Bank of the United States, but I want to kind of hash that out a little bit more, right? So here's just some statistics, right? The second Bank of the United States, when it was created, it was endowed with $35 million of capital, right? The stock was worth $35 million altogether. $35 million back then would be in the billions today, right? The Bank of the United States was only owned 20%. 20% of those stocks were owned by the Treasury, so the government, the public entity, only owned 20%, and the rest of it, 80%, was owned by private shareholders. So this is, in short, a public-private entity. Now, why does this matter, right? Well, it's a bank, and banks are for profit, right? Banks are there to, banks are designed to make money. And this bank wasn't just any bank, right? It's not just like Citibank, Bank of America, all, in today's world, powerful banks. But this bank also handled the nation's currency, right? And it was its main financial agent for handling national debt. So the problem with all of this, and this is hopefully the documentary kind of brought some of this out to light for you. The problem with all of this was that you have public goods, right, the money supply, being determined by a private entity. Now, the issue before us, or the issue before them, and it's still relevant for us, is what is money and who gets to control it? I would wager that a lot of economic textbooks, maybe some of you have taken economics classes in high school, maybe some of you are taking them in college, maybe some of you are interested in kind of pursuing that to one degree or another, but you got to understand it, because if you want to understand American history, if you want to understand history at all, right? If you understand what's going on in the world today, but especially if you're trying to understand the history of the United States, one color matters more than all, right? More than white, more than black, more than red, and that color is green. You got to understand the movement of money. So what is money, right? A lot of economics textbooks will lead you astray, right? I think a lot of economics is just complete BS, but I won't get into all that with you. Um, but money is basically debt. It's an IOU. It doesn't actually refer to something, right? So some theories of money, and this was a prevalent one in this time. Uh, Real money is something that just has this innate value, like gold, right? There's something about gold, right? Maybe it gets its value by the labor you have to put into getting it out of the ground. Maybe it gets its value because it's rare. Maybe it gets its value because there's something about gold. It's heavy, it's shiny, it doesn't rot. But not all people groups use gold and silver, right? Gold and silver become a predominant form of money in most parts of the world, ranging from China to ancient Rome. But that's not the only form of money there is. But what is money then if it's not referring to a piece of, a shiny rock, right? Money refers to debt, and debt refers to the kind of relationships between people in their laboring activities, right? You're not just like, you can think of money basically as IOUs, right? And in our circumstance today, right, if you open up your wallet and you look at a dollar bill, what's a dollar worth? A dollar was worth a dollar, right? It's self-referential at this point because United States currency is totally unhinged from, this was what was called the gold standard. And during the presidency of Richard Nixon, which is 1970s, he unhooks the dollar from the gold standard. So then what is a dollar referencing, right? In these times that we're looking at, the whole point of the money system was that you print out paper and the paper can refer you to a pre-existing quantity of hard money, right? So you could go to the bank and you could hand in your dollar and you get a dollar worth of gold, right? Or $10 worth of gold or $100 worth of gold. But in theory, the bank is supposed to have that real money, that then the papers are just IOUs. They're easier to carry than sacks of rocks around on your back, right? And of course, right, if you want to keep the gold in a bank, right, keeps it from being robbed, right? If you're carrying around a sack of gold with you, some guy could just take it from you while you're wandering home, right? It's dangerous to carry too much money, too much wealth. Where paper is easily concealed and it's easier to carry. And on top of it, and this is why the banking system became really challenging for people and created a lot of suspicion, was that banks could create money by their own design, right? And so this is a little bit strange, right? This is it's also sometimes referred to fiat currency, but a lot of people don't quite understand that private banks, including the banks that you deposit your money in, when they issue loans, when they issue, in this case, some of them could issue paper money back in the day. Now that's monopolized, but we won't get into all that. Um, they're creating money. So if you go to a bank today and you say, I want a loan for a home, I want a loan for a car, I want a loan for my business, I want a loan for something, right? The bank creates that money instantly, right? Today it's on a computer, right? You just punch in some keys, boom, the money exists, right? There's not like a vault full of so much money that they have, and if they spend all of it, then there's no money in the bank, right? No, the bank actively creates money, and the purpose is ultimately you want the loans to self-terminate, right? Eventually you pay back the money that the bank creates, but you pay it back in a different kind of currency, right? So in this case, right, you would go out and get dollars, or you'd get actual gold, hard money, and you'd pay the bank back in that. But the problem is, right, imagine you're a guy, you're writing IOUs. Is there anything to stop you from writing an IOU? Of course not, right? So you could keep writing IOUs even though the actual money that you possess, that it's supposed to connect to, doesn't exist. So you're creating money for the money supply, but if people try to call you on it and they want your money, the money that you've created to be transformed into a different kind of currency, so changing out banknotes for gold or silver or something like that, hard money, that's what it was called. you get in a lot of trouble because these banks would fold instantly, and the value of their notes only exists as much as the bank exists. So when you'd have runs on banks, you could topple them almost instantly. So what am I talking about? In short, right, you have this guy, he's issuing IOUs, right, he's writing pieces of paper, say IOU for this or that or the other thing, and he writes $1,000 worth of IOUs, but he's only got $100 in his wallet, right? So in the case that we're looking at, and this is what causes the 1819 panic, that caused a lot of Americans to be very suspicious of banks, and particularly the Bank of the United States. Um, well, what happens, right? What happens if all those people come back, right? If some of them say, well, I want the banknotes to be changed into gold, or in the case of this scenario, right? Give me the real dollars. I don't want your stupid funny money IOUs, right? I don't really believe that you can back it up, right? Or maybe I need this money because someone else won't accept it. Um, a lot of these banks, as I mentioned in previous lectures, doubled as land speculation companies. They would send these surveyors out, look at the land, see if it's any good, try to buy it up real cheap, and then sell it to people. But of course, a lot of people don't have the money to outright buy land to go build their farm. They need to take loans out to not only build develop the land, but sometimes even just to buy the land. So then these land holding companies, these land speculators, would then double as banks because they would issue loans. They would create a kind of currency that they say, okay, here's the money, right? I'm selling this land to you. I'm giving you money to buy a home and tools so that you can create a farm. But now you got to pay it back, and you can't just pay it back in bank money. You got to go out there selling your crops, doing whatever, and you'll pay it back to me that way. But of course, this scheme only works if people are able to pay back. If you can't pay back what you owe, the whole thing can collapse. And of course, if the banks are the ones creating the public money supply, right, there was no federal dollars, there wasn't a standard currency. Sometimes there would be multiple banks in a single state, but a lot of states just had one main private bank that the government contracted with, and they would print their own money. So you had Massachusetts dollars, you had Pennsylvania dollars, you had New Jersey dollars, you had New York dollars, you had Kentucky dollars, you had Tennessee dollars, you had South Carolina dollars. Then you'd also have sometimes foreign money. Um, we don't really experience this because the U.S. currency in the world is a dominant currency, but in other parts of the world, right, there's not just one kind of currency. And in fact, say, Central America, even though some countries have their own currency, most people would rather have US dollars because they seem to be more real than their own country's money. So, you'd have not only other state currencies, so if we're living in Pennsylvania, you might have New Jersey bucks floating around, New York bucks, Massachusetts bucks, maybe you'd even have British pounds, or you'd have Spanish dollars floating around, right? Currency is currency, and it's evaluated based on what people think it will be worth, right? If a bank issues money and the bank's, kind of unreliable, it's that their paper money is as good as me literally writing IOU on a scrap piece of paper and telling you, this is worth $100 in the future. Right? If you don't really believe that that's worth anything, then it's not going to be worth anything. Um, Also, there's all sorts of other problems with currency exchanges that banks wouldn't necessarily, $100 of Massachusetts bucks, you could get $100 of gold in Massachusetts, but if you're trying to change that note in Kentucky, it would be worth less than it being in Massachusetts because you got to move this money around. There's risk involved, right? You could get robbed. So maybe it's only worth $60 worth of gold in Kentucky. So there's a lot of complicated elements. And so the Bank of the United States was, in effect, trying to regulate all of this, right? One bank that could unite all the other banks. But like I said, this was a private bank. This bank existed not for the benefit of the country, not for the benefit of the public good. It existed to make its stockholders money, right? It existed to create loans, create a money supply that then it could regulate to the to maximize profit and minimize losses, which means you don't want too much inflation. You want the money supply to be working for the stockholders, right? Not necessarily the people in the country. And so the Bank of the United States became very powerful through this, right? It represented roughly 30 to 40% of the money in the money supply in the United States. So you had all these state bucks, and then you also had federal bucks that are coming through the Bank of the United States. And these notes were the closest thing that you got to the dollar in your wallet. But of course, again, this is not necessarily run for public benefit. So when the 1819 panic happens, which was partially caused by the Bank of the United States is in its land speculation, it was dabbling in all of this. It was issuing loans that were maybe very unsafe loans. And this, I'm not going to get into this too much, but if you know anything about recent financial crises, where we're in the middle of one, probably something comparable to the Great Depression, but who knows? But even before that, and we haven't even recovered from that as a country, there was the 2008 financial bubble, which was caused by housing. And so housing is land, and this is similar, it's analogous, but right, land speculation, housing speculation, it can go nuts, and then it explodes. And then you get kind of, the economy slows down. In the case of the 1819 panic, the Bank of the United States restricted the money supply to kind of curb the state banks from issuing out too many loans. So they're all private banks. When I say state banks, I don't mean they're public banks. They're not owned by the government. They're not manned by elected officials. They're for profit. They're businesses. They just have a contract with the state government in question to kind of work for them to some extent. But again, they're businesses, right? That's the government's basically their number one client. And this whole model comes to the United States through the work of Alexander Hamilton, and Hamilton's drawing on the role of the Bank of England for Great Britain. Nevertheless, the Bank of the United States restricts the money supply to try to rein in the state banks that are maybe a little bit too short-sighted. And this was all done by the same guy, right? This is all under the presidency of a guy named Nicholas Biddle, and you learned a lot about him in the last in the documentary in the last lecture. And this is what caused people to hate him, right? And so if banks are responsible for issuing money, but they're not issuing money in a responsible way, or they're doing it only to benefit the few, the stockholders, right? And not all of them are American, right? Some of them are foreign, and we're going to look at bits of that in Jackson's veto message, right? There are foreign owners of this bank, and many of the foreigners who have stock in the Bank of the United States are British. So of course, again, there's this anti-British phobia that here are the people who held us captive, right? They enslaved us, right? They ruled over us, this evil empire, and now they are investors in the Bank of the United States, which controls a huge chunk of the nation's money supply, right? This is a disaster, right? So this is just to fill this in, right? If you got nothing from all this, it's very confusing, it's very hard to understand, right? It's worth looking into, but a key element, there are two key elements, two takeaways, right? One, green is an important color in American history. You can't understand anything if you don't understand the economics, if you don't understand finance, if you don't understand the movement of money and capital in developing the United States as a country, right? Wealthy people got a hook in the government from a very early stage, and for, right or wrong, good or bad, they directed the affairs of the country. And so people tried to figure out what to do with that. You have the more Hamiltonian philosophy, which is it's inevitable, right? We're going to have these wealthy oligarchs, right? Of course, Hamilton's one of them. We're going to have these people forever. So you just try to make deals with them. They get rich, and there's some kind of trickle down for everyone else. Or you take a more Jeffersonian approach and you come after them with the machete, right? You take them out, right? You cut them out of the government. It's like a cancer that's about to grow and grow and grow and grow and take over all things. And we'll see how that develops. I would argue that Jefferson was a little bit more prescient. He kind of understood the dynamics. If he didn't rein this in and lop it out of the system, then it was going to grow and take over the system. You could only make so many deals, and that trickle down only really affects in a very minimal way Um, so, in our own circumstances today, if you look at the CARES Act, which is the coronavirus response bill, the relief bill, and there was trillions of dollars issued by the Federal Reserve, but only, a slice of it went to average Americans, right? The $1,200 check that you may have received or your parents have received. But a huge chunk of it went to people who are the investors who are holding, the idea was that we have to save the economy, so we have to give the people who invest in all these major corporations, we need to, basically keep them from selling all of their stocks, causing more panic in the stock market, and so on, right? But there are alternatives, and this seems to privilege the wealthy few at the expense of the not so wealthy many. But we're not going to get into all of that. All of that's just to give you the background and some of the underpinning why Jackson went to war with the bank and why Van Buren continues it. Now, Jackson's policies, right? If you've been following me so far, Jackson's policies might not really help in the long run. So Jackson takes the money out of the Bank of the United States, right? The documentary kind of covers that, and he puts it in what they were called the pet banks. And the pet banks were state banks, right? These were private organizations. So in some ways, this is like a feeding fest by piranhas, right? A lot of Democrats were not against the money power. They weren't against the financial system. They just felt like they were being blocked by Nicholas Biddle. Biddle was too rich, and so this is like a war between the like 0.01% and the 1%, right? The very tippy top tier of American finance, and then, other wealthy investors who feel like they're not getting their fair share. So the pet banks were rather corrupt and kind of resulted in this gave plenty of fodder to Jackson's enemies, right? When Jackson tries to regulate the economy with the Specie Circular, which says state banks have to stop issuing loans, right? And then they can only issue loans, they can only issue money if they actually give hard money, gold, silver, all this stuff. This doesn't immediately cause a financial panic, but it starts it up. But then 1837, right, some British investors in London, some American investors in Philadelphia, New York, they don't like Jackson's policies. They fear that they're going to lose out on their investment, right? The government seems to really be trying to squeeze the loan industry by making them only issue gold and silver, right? And so Jackson creates, they're called Jackson Eagles or Nationals, where the government was issuing coins that were made out of gold and silver, right? So no more paper money. But the Panic of 1837 results from investors getting scared and running. Now, some people blame that Jackson is just a poor policy manager, but then, you could also not like Jackson's policies, and as a wealthy investor, you could game the system by basically pulling all of your money out and provoking a panic. So Van Buren gets whacked with this, and he's sort of continuing Jackson's policies. He's probably the inspiration for Jackson's policies, and he gets blamed for the economic slump the country falls into. Now, I won't get into all the issues of whether Van Buren's policies would have worked or not, but I do want to explain that Jackson and Van Buren's turn to hard money right through the Specie Circular was a way of trying to curb banks from creating too much money in the money supply and causing this boom-bust cycle through paper money panics. Because again, right, I can keep writing IOUs, I can keep printing it out, but as long as it's not as long as it doesn't get called, it can work. But if it gets called out, right, people say, okay, I want my money in gold and silver, right? I don't trust you. I can't pay back my loans, so you're not going to get any gold and silver coming in from the interest rates on these loans or the cancellation of these loans. So then when people actually want to cash their money in because they feel like there's a panic coming, the whole system collapses. So one way of curbing that, and maybe it's not the most efficient way, was that, okay, well, we'll just limit it by literally restricting it to how much gold and silver can flow through the economy. So Van Buren continues this policy, but it doesn't allow the economy to bounce back. Banks can't just start offering what's called liquidity, where the bank can keep issuing loans. Right? This gets shut down, and so business in America seems to come to a standstill. So that's a huge part of Van Buren's presidency, this hard currency reform. And ultimately, he'll pass a law which will make the Treasury the only source of the money supply, right? The Treasury won't, right, for at least at the federal level, it's not gonna subsidize a private bank like the Bank of the United States. That won't come till later, until the Federal Reserve, and that has its own problems. But this basically tries to take the federal government out of the investment game. So there's upsides and downsides. On the one side, you're going to get a lot less corruption with the federal government if you can't use federal money. You can't use the actual money of the United States, its actual wealth, the gold and silver it has locked up. If you can't use that to invest in stuff and kind of gamble on things. So this cuts out a lot of corruption potentially from the United States government. On the other hand, this doesn't allow the federal government to invest in large infrastructural projects. So this gets to a political philosophy question of how involved the federal government should be in developing the nation. And as we saw 2 lectures ago, right, this was John Quincy Adams' vision. This is what will ultimately kind of put him on the non- or anti-Jackson side of the political equation. But not all Jacksonians thought this way. They were generally averse to corruption, and they were fearful of this growing financial power that was creeping in cities like New York and Philadelphia. But even Jackson himself is not against the idea of a national bank. But the idea was to devolve power as much as possible, and that when it came down to, say, creating new roads, that was not the responsibility of the federal government. That was the responsibility of the state. So major projects like the Erie Canal, you start to see the development of railroads in this time. We're going to get more of that too in another lecture. But all of this is said to either need to be at the state level. So if you want to build a railroad, the state needs to do it, not the federal government. Or it needs to be a private company, right? But not the government. They got to keep their hands out of this. So again, one argument would be this keeps out a level of corruption. So that's one interpretation of the Jeffersonian idea, of small government to prevent government corruption, and which could lead to tyranny, to domination from this powerful clique of people running things in Washington, D.C. over everybody else. Or the alternative Jeffersonian interpretation, which someone like John Quincy Adams picks up, is that no, the only way to secure the national good is you just need a public form of government. Now, John Quincy Adams supports the Second Bank of the United States as the best option, but there's also a strand in his thought that says, right, the national government needs to coordinate at least, if not direct, these large projects throughout the country, right? Something like the Erie Canal is, basically recreating a waterway through an entire state. You can't trust that to the state of New York alone, right? This requires more investment than the state's capable of, and it also is about benefiting the good of all the states, not just New York, right? And so even today, right, there are battles between states over control of water, over control of how to build roads, and so the federal government's now much more involved in this. But that's one interpretation of this Jeffersonian legacy. Jackson kind of embodies some of these ambiguities, but Martin Van Buren decidedly moves towards that first interpretation about trying to take the government out of these situations and try to shrink the power of the federal government over whether economics, infrastructure, or ultimately determining state policies. So that's part of him, pushing this hard money reform, because the government should not be involved in regulating the money supply. That should just be basically how much gold and silver exists. Of course, this can be gamed, this can be manipulated, this can be involved in a whole bunch of corruption. But Martin Van Buren thought this was the sort of minimal, least amount of damage, minimal amount, right? So besides that, though, he was also what's called, he was a dove in foreign affairs. He wanted peace. So I won't get into all this, but there was a war brewing in Canada that Martin Van Buren kept the United States out. Right, there were some people who wanted to, again, trying to channel that spirit of the War of 1812. We got to liberate Canada, and of course, there were some Canadians who wanted to be free from the British Crown. There were some Canadians who wanted to turn Canada into an independent republic. Whether or not they would have joined with the United States is a totally different question. But Martin Van Buren did not want to participate in that. He did not want the U.S. to go to war with Britain. He did not want the U.S. to meddle in foreign affairs. So he kept the U.S. out from meddling in Canadian affairs, which ultimately fizzle out and Canada remains part of the British Empire. Now we're going to get to in a later part of this lecture, but another thing that Van Buren did not want to participate in was the trouble brewing in Mexico. He wanted to keep the U.S. out of what was happening in what we'll talk about as the Texas Revolution, Texas independence, right? Van Buren did not want to get mixed up in all this. There were some people who wanted to get involved because they wanted, some people just wanted to help expand the United States in general. Some people saw Texas as a great add-on for the slave power, but Van Buren wanted to stay out of all of this. He didn't want the U.S. to go to war. Which again, right, as a small government kind of president, small government Jeffersonian and Jacksonian, Van Buren, wars tend to grow governments. Wars are financially burdensome, and so if you're going through a financial crisis, going to war is a disaster potentially. It'll just make you poor. But Van Buren was not really able to sort of cinch this. He got to 1840. He was very unpopular, right? There's an economic crisis from 1837 on. The country's trying to rebound. And so the forces of anti-Jackson, right, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about them in a minute, but, right, they're collectively known as the Whigs. And, they're not really a political party in the sense that you might think of it, right? They don't have a shared agenda. Many of the things that hold the Whigs together are just being anti-Jackson. So in the documentary, you see John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay and Daniel Webster all join forces as the Whigs. But John C. Calhoun and Daniel Webster have radically different ideas of what the government should be. So being anti-Jackson could bring a lot of different people together. But this wasn't enough. Even though they were really diverse, and so they were never really able to beat Jackson. He was too popular in the 1832 election. They couldn't beat Van Buren in 1836, but they finally pooled their resources, and Van Buren himself is not popular, and he's defeated in 1840 by a guy named William Henry Harrison, the president you've probably never heard of. So here's the electoral map. It's very clear that William Henry Harrison crushed Van Buren 53 to 46, right? There have been worse American elections, but it's a pretty solid majority. Turns out with 80% of the electoral college. So it's pretty decisive against Van Buren. And so not only was Van Buren super unpopular at this point just because people were going through an economic crisis, and yes, Van Buren is the successor of Jackson. Jackson's giving his endorsement to Van Buren, but Van Buren is being faced with a candidate that's almost like the anti-Jackson. And by that I mean he's also a popular general, but is campaigning on things that Jackson does not support, right? So William Henry Harrison wants a return to the Bank of the United States. He wants to pull the money out of the pet banks. He basically wants everything that Jackson doesn't want. A lot of Democrats are more eager for war than the Whigs are. Right? Even though Van Buren doesn't want to go to war in Canada, doesn't want to go to war in Mexico, a lot of Democrats do want to go to war in Canada and Mexico. But William Henry Harrison, he ran this campaign he got associated with log cabins and hard cider. At first, this was a joke. Van Buren is trying to make William Henry Harrison look like a stupid drunk, but this only made him more popular, right? He's this average guy hanging out with the common American citizen, able to sort of live in his little shack, his little self-made log cabin, and he's drinking his hard cider. He's drinking his, it would be like beer today. This was a very subtle pitch in some ways because William Henry Harrison, like Jackson, was not a commoner. William Henry Harrison was a very wealthy Virginian who moved to Ohio as part of a land speculating deal. But he was also a super popular general who connected with the people. His success, his fame came from winning the Battle of Tippecanoe, which crushed Tecumseh, right? If you remember all the way back in the War of 1812, right? So if that tells you anything, William Henry Harrison is an old man at this point. And so, in fact, actually, the Van Buren people made fun of William Henry Harrison. They said, this guy is like ancient. He's like a mummy. You might actually draw political parallels to the election today. But they made fun of how old William Henry Harrison was. And so he made a point of trying to show how young and vibrant he was. And he was still a man of action. He was still a man of the people. And so Harrison really ramped up the effects of Jacksonian democracy. And he appealed to the average common man, and so he would do these, not him personally, but a lot of his supporters, they would have these basically festivals where you'd get the band out, right? So you see people playing music, you got, random people showing up, they're drinking hard cider, you got guys stumping for the president, right? But it was fun, it was entertainment, and it got average people involved, right? This wasn't only for the politically well-connected elite people within the state capitals. This was for anybody. And you go and you show your support and you rally people for the president they want. A lot of Democrats would blame William Henry Harrison, right? We're okay with Jackson's popularity, but now you're getting everyone in a frenzy. But just suffice to say, William Henry Harrison only continued the effects of Jacksonian democracy, getting more and more of the average common American, and in this case, as voters, it was only white men, but it get the average American involved, and this would only spread and spread and spread to more and more people. So even as this democratization is ongoing, you're going to see it kind of spike up in conflicts, right? William Henry Harrison's only continuing Jackson's effects, involving more and more average common Americans within the political process, making democracy more and more important to an American system of government. And we're going to see that when that actually starts happening in places where there's very entrenched interests against it, you're going to get some pretty wild conflicts. But before that, just to sum up with William Henry Harrison, before we transition to another part of the lecture, part of the reason that most people have never heard of William Henry Harrison is that in a bid to show people that he's not this old man, he's not a mummy, he's not on the verge of death, he's actually a very youthful, energetic man of action. When he takes the office of the presidency, he gives a 3-hour inaugural address. 3 hours, right? 3-hour speech to prove that he's an orator. He can speak and he can channel the energies of America and develop the country in a better direction than he thinks Martin Van Buren's doing it. On top of that, he takes his coat off, and it's very cold. The presidential inaugurations took place in March at this time, not January that you normally associate with. But he takes his coat off. It's cold and it's raining, so he gives a 3-hour speech without a coat on before a crowd outside in the rain and in the cold. Unfortunately, because he did this, he contracted pneumonia. He got very sick, and he died. Maybe accidentally proving his enemies right. But William Henry Harrison is only president for a few weeks, and then he's replaced by his vice president, who gets known as his ascendancy or his accidency, John Tyler. But we're going to talk a little bit more about him later. Now, Jacksonianism started to spread throughout many parts of the country, but one place it really had a hard time taking root was Rhode Island. Rhode Island, in terms of other states, was one of the least democratic states available. It still had its constitution back from when it was a colony in the 17th century, right? So most states rewrote their constitutions during the American Revolution. Some even severely updated them at a later point in history. Property requirements were stricken. More and more people were allowed to vote. Now, of course, these constitutions tended to come with a racialization. So as more and more people got to be able to vote, restrictions on free black men voting became more severe, which basically locked them out of the political process. So, democracy has its ups and downs, I guess, but Jacksonianism also inspired the idea that all men should be able to vote, and then eventually all black men should be able to vote, not just rich or wealthy or well-to-do black men, which the older constitutions enfranchised because they were not fully racialized. They didn't mention that what color of skin you had to be to vote. But Rhode Island was one of these really, really old colonies that resisted any effort to expand its franchise. You had to own a significant bit of property to be able to vote in Rhode Island. And this was backed not only by conservative Whigs, but conservative Democrats. So both parties worked together, trying to keep the franchise to people who owned a significant chunk of land or had a big enough business, right? Which disenfranchised a lot of laborers, a lot of workers, a lot of farmhands, a lot of the average people. And it's funny because in Rhode Island, actually conservative Democrats blame the Whigs for the effects of democracy. They say, look at your William Henry Harrison. You made all of these people nuts, thinking they should all be able to vote. Well, into this maelstrom steps a guy named Dorr, right? Thomas Dorr, he was actually a rather, none of the terms exactly work, but we can call him a populist, right? He cares about the people, but he's a Whig. He himself comes from an elite background, but he believes that if you interpret, he's not for Jackson, but he supports the Whig ideas, but Whig ideas for the common man, for every man. And so he starts this crusade, right? To make a long story short, Thomas Dorr, he tries to run for governor. He gets banned. So he basically gets the people to elect him anyway as the real government of Rhode Island. And this ends up dividing society between the people who have and own property and the people who are basically just renters. People who don't actually own anything. They're just paying, borrowing their land from somebody who's wealthier and who actually owns it, right? They're not wealthy enough to actually buy it, or there's so few land, right? Rhode Island's a tiny state. A small clique of people already own everything, so you can't really even buy anything, right? There's no land to be purchased. Now, Dorr ends up dividing the people of the state, right? It divides them into a whole bunch of groups. The Whigs shift into being strictly the kind of conservative defenders of the landlords. The Democrats become generally the supporters of Thomas Dorr. But, party label doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. You got to look at things issue by issue. But the Dorr War was basically a fight to make Rhode Island more democratic. That the renters, the people who don't have, the laborers, the workers, they should vote to create a new constitution, to ratify a new constitution, and to elect Thomas Dorr to effect these changes. Now, there's a compromise over who gets to be the governor, but it becomes really hectic. Ultimately, Dorr, he himself doesn't want to go get violent. He doesn't want to get a militia involved. But Thomas Dorr almost has to escape from Rhode Island and be in New York. He seems to suggest that his allies who are in New York, people who are typically associated with Van Buren Democrats, but we'll get into all that later, they back Dorr and they threaten to invade Rhode Island. So it gets really messy. Thomas Dorr doesn't want the violence to get too out of control. But a lot of his more moderate supporters see his more radical supporters and they kind of back away from Dorr. Dorr himself doesn't want to get involved, so he actually turns himself in to be arrested by the Rhode Island government. But the judge who sentences him is a really nasty fellow. He thinks Thomas Dorr is a radical and he's destroying society, so he throws the book at Dorr and locks him in solitary confinement for upwards of 15 years. Now, this sentence doesn't get carried out. It gets appealed. But it takes about a year and a half to get Thomas Dorr out of jail. And by that point, he's a broken man. the Rhode Island government, fearing another uprising of Doer's supporters, offers some mild concessions, basically buying off the most moderate members to try to keep the state from being radically democratized, or the landholding interest of the state being threatened by the common man who's voting in his own interest and not in the interest of the landlord class. But it just shows, as this political cartoon depicts, right? Jackson's war against the elites, Jackson's fight for the common man. This was still ongoing. In places like Rhode Island, it seemed to have been a failure and a continued struggle, even among Jackson's supporters, even among Democrats, right? They didn't like too much democracy. They didn't like Thomas Dorr. They didn't like William Henry Harrison. They wanted to keep things the way that they were. Another crisis of increased democracy in the United States was what's called the anti-rent war. So this took place in New York. I mentioned many lectures ago, or it's probably a vague memory if you remember it at all, that New York was the least democratic or representative state or colony among the 13 colonies. New York was basically feudal. Most of the colony and then the state was owned by just a handful of landlords, particularly the Dutch, or the descendants of the Dutch. And of course, if you look at Van Buren's name, Van Buren is a descendant of a Dutchman, though he came from more humble origins. But there were very wealthy landlords in New York who were descendants of the original Dutch who settled there. A big guy who owned a huge chunk of upstate New York was a guy named Van Rensselaer. His name was Stephen Van Rensselaer IV. So this was this kind of family project. They owned big chunks of land. It was basically feudal, where most people in New York they didn't even have an assembly for a long time, right? So it was just an elite council that decided policies for the colony, and the people moving to New York, right? They're moving to the Americas to get land so they can have their own, piece of the country. They can have their own home. They're not being controlled by someone else, right? That was the dream of Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, but not New York. New York, people moved to New York and you became a renter. You'd have your own chunk of farmland, but you owed a certain percentage of your crops to the landlord, or a certain percentage of the money you make from your crops to the landlord. And on top of it, there was also some social customs that were involved. Like you had to address yourself to the landlord, like almost like you're his servant. You had to take your hat off for him. And so this policy, even though New York gets an assembly during the American Revolution, it gets a new constitution, it enfranchises many of these people, the landlord issue continues. So during the 19th century, reformers start to advocate that this form of land distribution is fundamentally anti-American, right? America is about the rights of the free citizen having his own chunk of the country. So how can we reconcile that with New York, where a handful of people, a couple dozen, own basically the entire state? And if you look at New York, right, New York City is very tiny on the map, even though that's where ultimately most people will live. But New York State is massive, right? What they call upstate New York. It's huge. It's almost the size of Pennsylvania, if not larger. I'm not actually sure if you compare them. Pennsylvania probably is larger, but New York is almost the same size as Pennsylvania. So these reformers want to change the dynamics. Now, again, like I said before, this doesn't quite map onto political interests. Now, Van Buren, even though he comes from more humble interests, he's connected with these wealthy Dutch landlords. The New York political machine is solidly democratic, but it has deep connections with the deep pockets of these landlords. So the Democrats in New York, even though Jacksonians want to reform issues in many other states, and even in New York, they want to reform other issues that pertain to labor. We're going to get to that in labor reform with a group that are known as Locofocos, but you can just sort of write that term down. We'll come back to it later. But when it came to the landlord issue, Democrats tended to close ranks and defend these large landholders. And the Whigs, while in many other states tending to defend the rights of the few, the Whigs in New York tended to support the average landlord. In Western state New York, you had a much more populist element of the Whigs. When we talk about anti-Masons, you probably already had referenced in the documentaries, if you remember, the anti-Mason party that contributes to Freemasonry just a little bit. There's not a whole lot in there about it. But they're one of the main building blocks for the Whig coalition against Jackson. And anti-Whigs tend to represent the interests of the common man. So the Whig Party in New York tended to be more populist against the Democrats who wanted to lock ranks to defend the landlords. But ultimately, this movement collapses for similar reasons that the Dorr War collapses. I won't get into all these interests. These reforms, they try to elect people. So a guy who will become important under Lincoln, right? And this is way off for the Republican Party, but this guy's a solid Whig at this time, this guy named Seward. The Whigs get support from Seward to pass these political reforms, to redistribute land, to not allow landlords to own these massive tracts, that these renters have more rights to the land that they work than the guy who has a piece of paper who says he owns it. Ultimately, though, these efforts are kind of unsuccessful. The more moderate members try to change things through elections and through the courts. More radical members who eventually call themselves Indians because they dress up like Native Americans and actually attack and beat up some landlords and fire off guns to try to scare people. This ends up dividing the movement. Moderates feel uncomfortable with the use of violence. The radicals are uncomfortable with the lack of success and the seeming never-ending cycle of political elections and compromises and attempts to try to get the courts to act on behalf of the landlords. Even there was this ultimately failed movement by the more moderate members to try to question whether Stephen Van Rensselaer's his deed to the land, whether it was actually even correct. Was it built on a lie, right? Did he actually own the land, or is the deed to the land actually fake? But this ends up, getting them nowhere. And ultimately, as I write here, the system is kind of rigged against the tenants. But this just shows continually, right? Jacksonian democracy keeps running up against these walls. Now, in this case, right, it's not about democracy per se, right? All these people can vote, unlike the Dorr War in Rhode Island. But it comes down to the question of economic democracy, right? If the vision of Jackson, right? And again, most of these people are opposed to Jackson, but they're in support of this idea that the common man is supposed to find representation in his government, and the government is supposed to protect and uplift the common man, not the few, at the expense of the many, right? How is this possible if your very means of living, your farm, your home, is being owned by another person, and that you have to serve that person, paying them a certain percentage of your rent, and then also engaged in these kind of servile customs, or, referring to them in these titles, taking your hat off, honoring them, right? This seems to be contradictory with the idea that America is for equality. So how can you have equality if land ownership is so wildly disproportionate? How can you have equality if some people are servants of other people, right? Again, this will get into the slave issue. This will radicalize some people. There's actually a political party at this moment called the Liberty Party that takes some of these Jacksonian ideas and they translate them into the slave issue, and they say, if we want to commit ourselves to the ideas of a democratic nation, slavery's got to go. But this is all kind of the consequences of Jackson's election, and then this new style of popular politics that's becoming the norm throughout all parts of American society. So I want to take this part of the lecture to shift gears in a pretty substantial way, almost like doing like a 180. And I want to talk about Mexico now. This is also a part of the effects of Jacksonian democracy. But let me tell you a little bit about Mexican independence so you kind of understand not only the Texas Revolution and Texas independence, but then how these issues become part of these Jacksonian ideas about the expansion of the United States, the development of the country, and especially the entrenchment of slavery as part of or as against the interests of the common man. So this guy here, his name is Hidalgo. He's this radical Mexican priest. He's a priest of the Roman Catholic Church, and he gets himself involved in an independence movement to separate Mexico from Spain. So to make a very long story short, Mexico will eventually declare war against Spain. There'll be a lot of fighting. Hidalgo himself will die, but he'll be succeeded by others, some of whom are just as radical, some of whom are less radical. And Hidalgo was interested in the idea of the average Mexican, which included not only those born who have Spanish blood, who are European, who have very fair skin, but also mixed people, indigenous people, so Indians, and then also Mexico had some slaves, but not that many. There wasn't that much of a need for slavery, and also Indians were worked as the laborers in the Spanish society. So we talked about these large plantations that were created throughout the Spanish Americas. This was all back in week 2. Right? We don't have to get back into all that, but there were some African slaves, and then there were Indians, and then there were also mixed people who took wives of either Africans or Indians, and so you had this whole mixed population. So you can see that, like, there's a variety of different kinds of Mexicans. There's a stereotype of what the Mexican looks like, who looks kind of indigenous, who looks kind of Indian, and a lot of Mexicans are mixed together. But if you turn on Telemundo, you can actually learn a lot about Mexican racial ideas, because when you turn on Telemundo, you see these beautiful blonde, fair-skinned women who are like the newscasters and running the talk shows and all this other stuff. But anyway, Hidalgo wanted a much more just Mexican society, so that indigenous people, mixed people, black people, everyone gets to participate. He wanted to end slavery. He wanted to end some of these more oppressive labor regimes for Indian people. Some of these kind of pass through, so when Mexico is independent, they'll abolish slavery, they'll rework some of these plantation arrangements. But ultimately, Hidalgo is succeeded by other people. The success of the Mexican independence movement really comes about when the army, which is fighting for the King of Spain, turns against the king, declares one of their own, the new King of Mexico, and this basically ends Spanish attempts to try to rein it in. So really it only comes about because elites in Mexico realize independence is probably better for them than continuing under the Spanish Empire. So this is the country of Mexico, right? And we're going to see how Mexico loses a huge chunk, right? It becomes reduced to everything below that red line. So what happens, right? How does this happen for Mexico? And it really comes down to looking at this one state here, the red state, and it's called Coahuila, Texas. So as a new country, right, Mexico is a kingdom. It has an emperor for a few years, but eventually they get rid of the emperor, and Mexico takes a government that's very much modeled on the United States. It has a federal constitution. So like the United States, Mexico's made up of a bunch of states. Still is that way today, right? Different, it's a lot more centralized in Mexico than it was back then. But each state had its own governor. It elected its own governor. These governors ran their own states, and then the federal government kind of managed the big picture stuff. Also part of this new federal constitution that's unlike the United States, it abolishes slavery. But again, there are not very many slaves in Mexico, and it's not lucrative, right? In the United States, slavery is attached to rice, tobacco, cotton, sugar in Louisiana. Not so in Mexico. Most of the money in Mexico comes from mining silver, and the people who mined silver were Indians. So you didn't really need slavery for any of that. So that's done away with easily. Mexico, like the United States, is dominated by powerful landlords and land-owning class. But unlike the United States, It has specific legal privileges to protect the military. So in the United States, the military has right, it has its own legal jurisdiction. There's military courts to try military infractions. But by being a member of the military, you don't get any special privileges when you're out in society, right? Not so in Mexico. The military was given its own special caste powers. So if you were just an average citizen, you didn't have, you operated under a different legal code than if you were a military man. And the military was not as subordinated to civilian power as it is in the United States. And then on top of that, you also have state Catholicism, meaning that unlike the United States, that doesn't declare any one church to be the church for the federal government, Mexico declares the Catholic Church as the church for the state. Now, this is a very different environment, well over, unless you're an indigenous person who has kind of folk beliefs that predate the arrival of the Spanish, everyone in Mexico is Catholic. So this isn't that radical. It's not like some scary takeover or something. Everyone is basically Catholic, except for a group we're going to talk about in a moment. And so this doesn't really ruffle anyone's feathers. Now, it does ruffle some people's feathers, though, and these are new immigrants moving to Mexico. So in the state of Coahuila, Tejas, it's two parts, but it's a single state. It's a single unity. One, the land is very good for agriculture. So this is modern day southeast Texas, and like where Dallas and places like that are. But it's also the border. And Mexico, we won't get into all of this, but Mexico, both as a colony and then as an independent state, has trouble dealing with an independent like horseback empire known as the Comanche. They kind of terrorize Spanish settlers. They terrorize other Indians like the Pueblo, if you've ever heard of them, that live in the Southwest. But Mexico needs to basically fill this border state with people to kind of buffer the rest of Mexico from the Comanche invading. So a lot of Mexicans don't really want to move up this way. It's dangerous. The ground is fertile, but there are other parts of Mexico where you can build your own little agricultural plantation without getting shot and stabbed or killed by an Indian or Comanche in particular. So Mexico reaches out to another immigrant population to basically flood into this border zone, and those are the Americans. Now, the Americans who moved to Texas, first by a guy named Moses Austin, and then his son Stephen Austin, which is where the city of Austin gets its name. They make a deal with these Americans to move in, and the interest the Americans have for Texas or Coahuila, Tejas, is cotton, and cotton is grown with slaves. So the Americans move in, but they're immediately butting up against the governor. The governor supposedly is supposed to uphold the federal constitution, which one, bans slavery. Of course, the guys who are moving to this place are bringing their slaves with them and just lying about their status, saying, oh no, they're free people, they work for me. But of course, they're slaves. And then second of all, they're not converting to Catholicism. Catholicism is the state church, but these guys, most of them are Protestants. We won't get into all that, but they just don't want to be Catholic, and so they kind of pretend it, or they'll do a conversion, but they don't ever really act on it. It's like fake conversions. And while this annoys people in the federal government, people in Mexico City, the governor of Coahuila, Tejas, is what's called a liberal. Mexican politics are split between two groups, the conservatives and the liberals. We won't get into all that, but a lot of liberals in Coahuila, Tejas are quite comfortable with the facts of Anglo-American life, right? They know they're breaking the law, but they're going to wink at it. They don't care. It's good for the economy. It's good for business. And most liberals, and this is what makes liberals different from conservatives in Mexico, are not comfortable with the role of the state church, and they're not comfortable with the role of the army, and they want the state governments to have more power. So the governor of Coahuila, Tejas, even though he knows that these guys are all breaking the law, he just pretends like they're not. And he lets them bring their slaves. He lets them set up cotton plantations, and he lets them basically practice their own religion and not be Catholic. Now we're going to get a lot more into cotton in the next lecture, but just if this phrase helps you understand it, cotton was also known as white gold, right? So if sugar was the king of the 18th century, cotton is king in the 19th century. It's super important, right? We already kind of mentioned this a little bit, but I really want you to get this down. You can't understand, if you can't understand America without understanding money and finance, you definitely can't understand it without cotton. Cotton is king. Cotton influences Southern society, as we're going to learn in the next lecture, and cotton influences Northern society. A lot of people invest in cotton. We're going to look at how the slave system works, but just make sure you know, right? Underline cotton, circle cotton, write it in all caps, right? It's super important. It defines slavery in the United States, and it will ultimately be the main reason why the Civil War was provoked, right? If Civil War is caused by slavery, slavery is deepened and expanded and developed because of cotton, and the value that slaves provide for harvesting this super valuable crop. Anyway, to make a long story short, right, these Anglo-Americans in Coahuila, Tejas, they get annoyed with the federal government. The federal government starts to kind of clamp down on them because it gets taken over by a very ruthless, pragmatic, and cynical general by the name of Santana. Now, Santana, as part of his power play, wants to really rein in these independent state governors, especially the liberal ones. And so Coahuila, Tejas is public enemy number one because it's basically flaunting the authority of the central government. It's knowingly allowing foreigners to break the law and basically invade the country, all this illegal immigration. It's kind of funny because now it's the other way around. But all this illegal immigration flowing into Mexico from the United States, and bringing in things that are totally against the law. So whether or not Santana himself was a conservative, he was a large plantation owner too, but he was pretty flexible with his politics. He started as a liberal, then became a conservative, then he kind of goes and does his own thing. But Santana sends the Mexican army to stop the Anglo-Americans. And so this leads to first the Coahuila, Tejas governor and the group of Spanish-speaking Mexican, they're called Tejanos. You can contrast that to the Anglo-American Texans. But they join forces. And at first, they just want Santana to be kicked out. They want the government to be less intrusive. They want to kind of go back to an old arrangement of things. So they're just resisting and trying to drive Santana out. But eventually, for these Texans against the Tejanos, they think, look, our future is not going to be with Mexico. Our future is with the United States. And as more and more of these immigrants moved into Coahuila, Tejas, the dominant population, especially in the northern part, were these Texans, these Americans, these English-speaking, non-Catholic, slave-holding Americans. So they decide at some point during this war isn't just about rolling back Santana, it's about independence. During this war, that's where the famous Battle of the Alamo, where Santana sends his army and a ragtag group of Americans hold this tiny missionary fort down. They lose. The Mexican army crushes them eventually, but it's like this really drawn out battle, and it's very bloody, and it shows and demonstrates American valor where few stand against many and hold them back. Now, it's sort of overblown. There are dramatic depictions of this in movies. Santana had a massive army, it's true, but most of the people that Santana had in his army were under-equipped and under-trained. Some of them didn't even have shoes. So it's not really much to say, oh, look, well-equipped, well-trained, really roughneck Americans fighting for their lives hold their ground against poorly trained, poorly equipped, and, under-motivated guys, right? The Americans are fighting for their lives. The Mexican army is doing it because they're getting paid and they don't want to get shot by their commander. A lot of people who join armies do it out of desperation, not out of a sense of patriotism. And a lot of armies throughout this time are not really well equipped. They don't all have guns even. They don't have shoes. Not all of them have uniforms. So Santana's got this ragtag army, but he's got a lot more people, and he can just keep throwing them at the Texans. So he beats them at the Alamo, but after a series of battles, the Texans regroup, and they actually defeat Santana, and they capture him. And so, as a part of a deal, Santana will say, okay, let me go. Let me get back to Mexico City. I'm going to reassert my control over the government, and I'll cash out a deal, right? Texas can be independent and separate as its own country. So by the end of 1836, Texas has its independence, and with the new government of Texas, the independent state, it passes a new constitution which enfranchises a lot of these Anglo-Americans. It gets rid of the state requirements of Catholicism, and it legalizes slavery, and it starts passing these sort of racialized laws that cut these Tejanos, who were former allies, who are, they're mixed people, they're Mexicans, they're not English speaking predominantly, though I'm sure some of them, and the elite ones know English, and elite Texans know Spanish, but they get pushed out of government, and Texas becomes solidly American in a lot of its dimensions. Now, to make a long story short, Texas is at first, for its 10 years as an independent country, divided between two major factions within its own state assembly. There's one faction that says, look, the future of Texas is going to be with the United States, so we need to ask the United States to accept us as a state, right? Now, there's another faction that says, well, no, if we are aggressive enough, we can hold our own. We can kind of carve out a Texas empire, drive west to the Pacific coast, and Texas can form its own trade relationship with Great Britain. And Britain is the main buyer of American cotton, so maybe Texas's future would be better off being an independent power, cutting her own deal with Great Britain, and kind of worrying about ourselves and not the rest of the United States. And this was a real option, that Texas might have actually tried to be an independent country. In retrospect, it's kind of obvious that Texas would be part of the United States. Right? These are all the same people. They all speak the same language. They all came from pre-existing United States, areas. Places like Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, Georgia, Louisiana. That's where they're migrating from. So it's only natural that they would want to reconnect with their homeland. But there was a real debate about what Texans would do with their independence. Now, in the United States, there was a big faction of Democrats, both in the North and in the South, that want Texas to join the United States. Some of these Democrats, particularly the ones in the South, want Texas to join the United States to bolster the Democratic Party and bolster the interests of the slaveholders, right? The Democratic Party during this period is increasingly becoming the slave party, but it's not the slave party. There's still many Democrats who don't own slaves, who believe in Jackson, sometimes even against slavery. There are some Democrats are actually abolitionists. They're opposed to slavery, but they're sort of willing to compromise and work it out on their own terms. We'll get to that in a future lecture. But that's just to say the Democrats are not strictly the slave party, at least not yet. In the 1850s, they will be the slave party. But Southern Democrats are the slave party in general, and they want to absorb Texas because this will make them more powerful. They'll get more senators, they'll get more representatives, and this will allow them to advance their interests. Now, Northern Democrats who are maybe willing to compromise over the slave issue, their interest in absorbing Texas is just about expanding the United States, right? The more land that gets access to, the more land the U.S. gets access to, the more the United States will develop and will be able to spread not only its form of government, but allow Americans to literally spread themselves across the continent to, get pieces of land so that every American citizen can have his own plot, his own home, and his own way of life. And so this is what's called manifest destiny. And this is actually where the term comes from a Northern Democrat who believes Texas and the whole of Mexico actually needs to be absorbed by the United States as part of America's inevitable destiny where, that's why it's called manifest. It's obvious, it's unfolding. Americans are spreading across the continent, and eventually all of the Americas will belong to the United States. Canada, Mexico, and perhaps all of Central and Southern America. And this wasn't necessarily a war of conquest. It was very utopian. A lot of these people genuinely believed that when the American form of government spread, people would just flock to it. And for the guy who really coined the phrase manifest destiny, a guy named O'Sullivan, he thought this was almost like a force of nature. The inferior races would die out. The superior races, which really meant the white Anglo-Americans who were spreading across the country, they were going to be the victors, and they were the only ones who were going to be around. Not because there was genocide, not because they went and killed off all the race. He didn't have this idea of race war. It was just sort of, it was almost like this Darwinian evolutionary event, right? The powerful, the superior, will swallow up the inferior, and they'll just sort of disappear as the powerful take their place. And the powerful in this was the average American man, who's through his ingenuity, his smarts, his can-do attitude, his work ethic, the idea that he will just show up and not just sit on his plot of dirt, but convert it into a farm which is highly productive and kind of transform the land as he goes. Right? This was going to make all the Americas super rich and super wealthy because these people just know how to work the land. They know how to invest themselves. So that was also the idea of taking Texas. It was a part of this unfolding of America's destiny. Now, there were also people who were against it. Some Northern Democrats and what are called conscience Whigs were against the idea of taking Texas because Texas is a slave country. And so if it becomes part of the United States, it will get slavery with it. So they don't want to expand the power of the slave-owning interests. And then on top of it, there were some Whigs who were not necessarily opposed to the idea of slavery. These are what would be called, probably Cotton Whigs. They're more conservative. They actually have pretty strong relations with the Democrats, or not the Democrats, the slave-holding South. But they don't want to imbalance the power dynamics, right? If you add another state with new representatives, new senators, you're going to split North and South. So the goal of these more conservative Whigs is maintaining the balance of power. So many states in the North that don't have slaves, so many states in the South that do have slaves, and they kind of cancel each other out. One side isn't more powerful than the other. But with Texas, the slave power would become even more powerful, and this would seem to disadvantage Northern interests and kind of reformat the relationship. Now, we're going back, William Henry Harrison dies. He's succeeded by Tyler. Tyler, without getting to all the nuts and bolts of this, Tyler gets the nomination basically to woo over conservative Democrats. And these are the people who support the idea of Jackson's pet banks. They support the idea of breaking up the Bank of the United States. But they're also not happy with the Specie Circular. They're not happy with Jackson's actions during the nullification crisis. This seems to make the federal government too powerful. So John Tyler, who is a Virginian, he was very well connected with the State Bank of Virginia. And he was the kind of, he was conservative Jacksonian. He gets wooed over against Van Buren. And even though the Whigs don't really like Tyler, they see him as a compromise. And they say, well, what's the likelihood of him being president? He's the vice president. Vice president don't have that many powers. Well, whoops, right? He does become president. And so his administration is basically a constant gridlock because none of the Whigs support him. The Jacksonians basically don't support him as a traitor. And so he barely is able to kind of keep things going. Now, he's able to power up the state banks. He keeps the project going that Van Buren had going of dumping the money out of the Bank of the United States into these state banks and supporting them. But because the Whigs are so adamantly against him and enough Jacksonians are skeptical of him, he can't actually fulfill his true desire, which was to absorb Texas in the United States. So his presidency from 1841 to 45 is very uneventful and ultimately does not provoke the crisis which will cause the United States to go to war with Mexico. Now, after the election of Tyler, he is succeeded from 44 to 48 by a guy named James K. Polk. Now, Polk was a loyal Jacksonian. We won't get into all the nuts and bolts of the politics, but he was a very unlikely candidate. But he stops Henry Clay again from getting the presidency. As a solid Southern Democrat and as someone who's a true believer in manifest destiny, Polk is very much committed to absorbing Texas. So when he's elected president, Polk passes through the necessary measures. Texas becomes part of the United States. But there are interests, right? Not just for Texas, but there's other parts of at least the northern parts of Mexico, if not the entire country, that slave owners and land-hungry northern Democrats are eager to get access to. So Santana's still in power. He doesn't like the kind of ambition and arrogance of this new American administration. Polk starts issuing these commands, right? Santana needs to back away from the Texas border. He needs to move the Mexican army far away. Polk will send a United States Army down under the command of General Zachary Taylor. The U.S. ends up kind of basically under Polk provoking a war with Mexico by moving U.S. soldiers in a very complicated area. Now remember, there's no GPS. How are you supposed to know whether you're in the United States or in Mexico? There's no wall. You're supposed to just know. There are vague borders drawn on a map. But after the U.S. Army kind of provokes the Mexican army into a fight, Polk claims that American blood was spilled on American soil, that the Mexicans had invaded, and so this begins the Mexican-American War. Now, Polk had these ideas for invading Mexico from very early on. He had a whole blueprint for if the United States goes to war with Mexico, that the U.S. Navy would automatically seize California. So that's what it does. 1846, as soon as the war happens, Polk moves into California. California declares itself independent from Mexico. For a few days, it's its own country. It's called the Bear Republic. But then it's absorbed as part of the United States as a territory, eventually becoming the state of California. Now, the war at first is a standstill. The U.S. Army can't push far enough south down. Santana's army's blocking them, and Polk realizes he's running on a ticking clock. Now, while he got the congressional majority to declare war and to begin fighting Mexico, many Whigs are super suspicious, right? Conscience Whigs, they don't want slavery. They believe that this war is basically a trick to get slavery expanded. So, and we'll come back to that in just a second, but Polk knows that if he can't win this war quick enough, Congress might turn against him, try to button up the war effort as soon as possible, and try to get a peace with Santana on less favorable terms. Terms that are not going to ultimately benefit the United States or the state of Texas. So under Zachary Taylor, he's leading this army. Polk actually thinks Taylor's screwing it up on purpose, but Polk with his generals comes up with an amphibian strike, right? And this is memorialized in the U.S. Marines hymn, where it says, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli." Right? We already talked about shores of Tripoli referring to Jefferson's Barbary Wars, but the halls of Montezuma refer to Mexico City because the United States Marines lands in this amphibious invasion right outside of Mexico City. Right? They sail down the Gulf of Mexico into the capital, and after some really bloody fighting, the U.S. Marines capture Mexico City. They drive Santana out, and then he's ultimately sacked by other Mexican elites who realize, this is the last straw. Santana is useless, right? He had been thrown from power before after losing Texas to the United States, but he acts very valiantly in another battle. We won't get into all that. France invades Mexico, and Santana helps fight back the French. And so he becomes popular again. He becomes basically dictator. But this is the last straw. He really screwed up this time. And so he gets booted out and he dies in exile. He goes to Europe after this. But these new Mexican officials, the new Mexican government, they hash out a treaty with the United States called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And this basically gives all of the Southwest that we're familiar with, right? The states of New Mexico, Arizona, the western part of Texas, California, even as far north as Colorado. All this, which was formerly part of Mexico, now becomes part of the United States. Now, like I said, not everybody wants this treaty, and the treaty itself is very controversial because by welcoming in these other territories, are they going to go the way of Texas? Are they going to become slave states? So we already mentioned, right, Whigs are opposed to this war, and some of them at least. Some of them are opposed because they don't want the balance of power changed. Others are opposed because they don't want slavery to be expanded. So a young one-term congressman during this time, during 1846 to 1848, by the name of Abraham Lincoln. Right, nobody knows who this guy is. Total no name, nobody. Ultimately, kind of a loser because he loses his congressional re-election in 1848. But he is opposed to the war in Mexico, and he'll refer to it, right, as a war of conquest to catch votes, right? So the whole point of this war is by Polk trying to get the people involved. It's cynical ploy. It's just about trying to stir people up. See, oh, you're going to get more land. Everyone's going to have access to free stuff. You know, we're going to be, you know, this whole manifest destiny ideology, right? You know, it's all bull, right? It's all BS. It's just about stirring them up because all this land is going to go right into the pocket of the slave owner, right? And we're going to get into the issues of free soil in a future lecture. But Whigs who are opposed to this because of the expansion of slavery, because slavery is a moral evil, will be joined by a group of Democrats from the North who are opposed to the idea that Texas and all this future territory will become part of a new slave wing of the South. Not only is this going to imbalance things, but Northern Democrats are fearful of what they call the money power, the financiers in New York, and they're afraid of the slave power, right? These elites who own huge tracts of land, right? Only about 3% of slave owners own more than 50 slaves. So the vast majority of slave owners own a few slaves, you know, usually between 2 and 4. We're going to get more into that in the next lecture. But, you know, the vast majority of slaves are owned by a few people who run these massive plantations and are the equivalent of millionaires or billionaires in their own day. So Northern Democrats are suspicious. They're Jacksonians, right? And this is why this is part of this lecture, right? They're supporting this war against elites that are stripping the common man of his rights and stripping the common man of his dignity. So how could you support this war, right, if it's going to ultimately privilege the slave power? So this guy right here, this is a picture of him. His name's David Wilmot. He was a congressman from Pennsylvania. He leads this issue into Congress by saying, look, war with Mexico, maybe it's inevitable, right? We got to defeat them. We got to defend American interests. We got to help expand the territory so that more Americans have spaces to go. But slavery is going to take away opportunities for Americans to settle in these new lands. So, you know, what if we pass a bill in Congress that says any new land taken by this war, right? This is years before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo signed. Any new land, Wilmot passes this proviso. It gets the name Wilmot Proviso, right? Any new land taken by this war will be a free territory. Now, ironically, right, even though this is very popular among Northern Democrats, it gets defeated in Congress because the Whigs team up with conservative Democrats, with the plantation owners, to block it. And not only is it because some Whigs are in the interest of the slave power, but also some Whigs don't want to add more territory because they just don't want to add any more land and possibly create power imbalances within Congress and within the federal government. But it just shows you these new fracture lines that are appearing. Southern and Northern Democrats are starting to fight each other over the issue of slavery. And particularly, it's about whether slavery should expand, but some Northern Democrats are going as far as to say slavery should not exist at all. Now, they're not going to wage a radical war. They don't necessarily want to purge it out of land. We're going to get to that in the slavery lecture in the next week, but also with the reform movements. But they do want slavery to be removed from American society. Now, ultimately, and this is gonna pull into a lecture a couple weeks from now, but this is gonna set the new standard. The territory that's gonna come into the United States is gonna be divided up between free states and slave states. California will come in as a free state, but Texas, the rest of Texas will be expanded as a slave state. Other territories are being negotiated on how they're to be absorbed in the Union, but the goal by new architects within Congress is, okay, we'll bring in one free state for one slave state, and we'll try to balance them so that the power balance doesn't ever change. The North will remain free, the South will remain the slave state, slave society, and never the two shall meet. Now, of course, this is provoking a possible crisis. Northerners are starting to view themselves as a totally different society. Southerners are starting to view themselves as a totally different society. How can they exist as a single country if they have totally different ways of managing their own politics, their own economies, and their own ways of life? Now, there are elites in both the North and South. They're all mixed together. Now, the idea of a southern nation will become popular at a later point. But at this point, right, most people are trying to hold things together. But the debate over slavery is rapidly intensifying and starting to define all political issues in the United States. And so the Jacksonian democracy issue starts to be strictly linked to the question of slavery. And so in future lectures, we're going to unpack what is slavery, what happens to Northern society to make it very different from the South, and how does this ultimately turn into a crisis that will result in the Civil War. So until that time, right, I'm your host, John Parks. I'll see you next week, and keep hanging in there. Peace, guys.